Hello fellow humans. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about the 4.3 banners upcoming very soon. Now, I kinda neglected making videos like this since the Yao Guang beta because I'm not joking, I genuinely became afraid of giving my genuine opinion on character value because the videos would usually devolve into like a cesspool of people just saying whatever or like getting mad at me or like hoping I'm wrong. And Yao Guang beta left me scarred, right? I know this is insane to say. I've been through Feainon beta, I've been through Sirene beta, I've been through every beta since like mid Pentagony, right? But this was definitely the worst by far and the one that affected me the most. However, I've decided let's just go back into getting into the groove of things. And yeah, without much more yap, let's get into it. So to start us off, we have the obvious outlier in the room being the actual only new limited M Blade or Mordenax Blade. So Blade is the greatest generalist in the game currently, right? No one even touches him at E0 as 0 comparing to other characters at the same investment. 50% vulnerability, 30% defense reduction, and because he's a nihility, he can use lycones like pearls or whatever, and he can get even more defense down on the enemies. And then he also has damage bonus, and then if you're using an ult damage DPS with him, a total of 125% damage bonus can be taken advantage of. So as you can clearly see, quite strong, right? Quite fierce. However, not only this, he also revives an older DPS that a lot of people love, being Acheron. He is basically Acheron's Dahlia equivalent. He is her best in slot by a mile, and Acheron is looking much more promising in comparison to today's meta teams with a Blade on her team, right? So I would highly recommend, if you're an Acheron main, you feel like she's been falling off the last few years because she hasn't gotten enough support, I would say that Blade is a quote-unquote must-pull if you really love Acheron and want to continue using her. He is absolutely exceptional for her and for supporting her. On top of that, he also has a little bit of damage. He also has this gimmick where he's able to taunt enemies, so allies on your team take less damage, making it easier to sustain. He has multiple benefits that are just incredibly useful. And then of course, outside of Acheron teams and outside of his great general capability, you also have his follow-up team. This is 100% going to be his most meta team in this entire version, and this is probably the one that a lot of people are looking forwards to, with like Avon SP and Ashvale and maybe even a future sustain, right? So very good character. I'd argue he's probably the highest value character just at all in the game currently, not only because of his general support capability being so exceptional, but also because he revives an older DPS who had the most sales in the history of the game, by the way, and then also he's part of a new team that's also incredibly meta, all three at the exact same time. This guy has a really stupidly strong kit that I'd highly recommend people pick up if they're looking for him for his meta value. Now let's move on to the next rerun, which is Yao Guang, right? As mentioned at the beginning of the video, this topic is a little touchy these days. However, the reality is, as more time has passed and 4.2 beta has passed, a lot more people are open to the realization that Yao Guang is likely going nowhere. She's likely going to be a core support for every single Elation DPS. There could be another one releasing later, there could not. However, my assumption is that Yao Guang will be the core support for every single Elation DPS. Some of you may be asking, oh, but what about EMC? Where's the EMC replacement? Yao Guang is the EMC replacement. When you compare their kits, EMC doesn't give anything more unique than Yao Guang, and EMC's ult is even just a weaker version of Yao Guang's, where Yao Guang's replicates an AHA instant, copying all allies' elation skills, while EMCs can only copy one ally's elation skill, right? So EMC does just seem to be Walmart Yao Guang. Yao Guang is the upgrade, and I don't really see anyone replacing her. It could happen, right? It could. However, I usually like to, take things and talk about things in terms of the likelihood that said thing happens. And in my opinion, it's just incredibly unlikely that Yao Guang is getting kicked out of literally any Elation DPS team. I think she's there the entire time. A lot of people use the argument that, oh, there's going to be support or overlap if you want multiple of these Elation DPSs, but people act like this is something new. Break uses Dahlia, Break uses HMC, Break uses Ruan Mei, and that's also 3 different main DPSs, right? You have among the Chrysos heirs, a ton of them like using RMC, a ton of them have Sirene as a best in slot, so on and so on and so on. Support overlap is inevitable. Not every single DPS can get a full team of dedicated supports. That's usually a privilege that is specialized for the main pushes, right? Like Silverwolf and probably Nihilux later on and stuff like that. So with all that being said, yes, I do think Yao Guang is a must-pull for Elation and probably will continue to be for the next 1 or 2 years. Incredibly, incredibly valuable. I do not see her going anywhere. She has a pretty decent E1 as well. The only team where you can quote-unquote use her generally, I'd imagine, is probably Archer, because she is one of the most SP-positive 3rd slot AoE supports. However, even then it's kind of scuffed. I'd really say Yao Guang is only this important if you are going into the Elation meta. If you are not going into the Elation meta, then you don't give a shit. It's the same thing with Sirene, where if you didn't pull any Chrysos Air DPSs, then you don't really give a shit about pulling Sirene at all, and you can easily skip her, right? So that's my thoughts on Yao Guang. Then we move on to the second half. The second half has 2 reruns consisting of Feainon and Sirene. Let's start off with Feainon. Do I think Feainon is worth it? Starting from the bottom, starting from nothing? No. I would not pull I would not pull Feainon now that we're in the current meta that we're in, because even the half-built teams that aren't finished yet from 4.x are stronger than Feainon and competing, if not beating, E2 Feainon, which is just incredibly impressive and a vast difference in strength. It's not that Feainon wouldn't be able to clear. However, if you're starting from nothing, you'd need a decent bit of investment, in my opinion. You'd probably need Feainon, then you need his Ceridra, then you need Sirene, then you need his Lycone, and this is probably what the average player would need in order to just clear the endgame content. Of course, someone who has min-maxed his relics, optimized the rotation, knows better with his gameplay, would obviously be able to clear better, but I do try to look at things from the perspective of a casual player. I do not think Feainon is worth pulling on at all if you are starting from nothing, right? Now, it's a different story if you are starting from something. If you already have a Ceridra, if you already have a Sirene, if you already have a Feainon with his Lycone, you already know what I'm going to say, right? E2 Feainon. It is the most broken E0 to E2 jump in the entirety of the game, and it's the one that most fixes a character's almost entire flaws. E0 Feainon, his main issues aren't even necessarily MOC, but much more notable in endgames like Pure Fiction and APOC. His E2 is where this saves him the most. Keep in mind, in MOC alone, it's already, I believe, the biggest E2 jump in the entirety of the game. However, when you go into APOC and Pure Fiction, it's an even larger jump in performance in comparison to his E0. So E2 Feainon still holds up to this day incredibly well. So this is the #1 thing I'd aim for if I was a Feainon main trying to invest further into him, right? The other thing would obviously be E2 Sirene, which I'll get into a little bit. However, that is a little more expensive, and this is only worth it if you already have E2 Feainon. I don't know if Feainon is really a character that worth going into, like, starting nearing the 10 cost range for his team. But if you're a really dedicated fan, I would say E2 Sirene is his next best option after, like, Saridra and E1 Saridra. Keep in mind, Feainon is the only Amphoria support who at E2 can actually get 0 cycles against MOC without any of his best in slot supports. He is very general, very easily able to be buffed, which means he does indirectly get buffed by newer, stronger supports quite often, which is why I always praise his E2 value and prioritizing that before his teammates. For example, a lot of Feainon's best low-cost clears against endgames these days isn't even with the team you'd think of Saridra plus Sirene. It's with Nova Sparkle, right? Nova Sparkle. And Nova Sparkle, not only is she so strong, but she was given for free to a lot of people through the 4.0 selector. So even though it shows as like 4 cost, 5 cost on these clears, for a lot of people it didn't even cost them anything. And now it's rumored that Sunday is going to get a Nova Flare on the same level, if not even slightly stronger than Sparkles. So Sunday also gets a Nova Flare. It is a reality that you can run Nova Sparkle plus Nova Sunday with Feainon, and I imagine it would probably be quite comparable, if not even possibly be stronger than the Sirene Saridra combo that Feainon usually runs currently. So this is why I highly recommend getting that E2, getting that S1 before you even think of actually investing into his supports. And once you get out of that out of the way, then you can consider Saridra, E1 Saridra, Sirene, possibly E2 Sirene, stuff like that, right? Next, we move on to Sirene. Now, Sirene, if you've been a frequent watcher of me recently, ever since her beta, I've had major issues with her kit because it's very unbalanced. Not in terms of being broken, but in terms of certain buffs for certain characters are significantly stronger than certain buffs for other characters. The main example I can give here is her buff for Anoxa. It's fucking insane. It's genuinely disgusting. You generate skill points, you massively buff his damage to the point where he nearly does 2x of that, right? And then even the buff works team-wide, although it is for only 1 turn until he uses it up. And then the combination with Saridra, allowing him to do 4 skills with this buff up, is just absolutely exceptional. Sirene for Anoxa is genuinely something else. However, the reality is most of her buffs aren't like this for Anoxa anymore, and because of the natural power creep progression in this game, the reality is she's only best in slot for like half, if not less, of the Chrysos heirs at this point, right? Feainon, most of his best clears these days don't even use her. Mono Rem, believe it or not, can now actually use M-Blade and achieve the same performance investment versus investment against endgame content. So M-Blade can easily replace Sirene on a Mono Rem team with Cassie Evernight Hyacine. You won't even notice the difference. And then on top of this, you have things like Sparkle Nova Flare, that buffed Archer. You have Sunday Nova Flare upcoming and Gilga. This means the only argument people really had for Sirene's general value being like ult DPSs, right? Because there's literally no ult support in the game. There's no competition. That is probably going to disappear soon because Saber, one of the few good ult DPSs these days outside of obviously new Evanescia, she can just use Gilga and probably Nova Sunday whenever that's upcoming soon. So the only teams I believe Sirene is actually important to pull on currently is My Day, Anoxa, and Aggie. Yeah, I think these are basically the only ones at this point. And Evernight main DPS, sorry. There is that. But you'll notice every single character I just mentioned are characters who didn't get any dedicated teammates. So Sirene has no competition, and that's the only reason why she's best in slot, in my opinion, to begin with. So yeah, those are my thoughts on all these characters upcoming, all their, value in the meta. You can say I'm biased towards Sirene. I'm not saying she's bad. I do think E2 Sirene is an incredibly good investment for specifically Feainon and a little bit of Noxa, but much more Feainon. Feainon is the character who mostly benefits from E2 Sirene in comparison to any other Chrysos heir, and it's not even close. E0 versus E2 Sirene value is game-changing for Feainon because of the fact that it now makes it you can run Sustainless with non-Chrysos heir characters like Nova Sparkle and Nova Sunday, who have significantly better buffing because they're newer, and you still won't die before you enter the ultimate, meaning you're able to give Feainon much more potent buffing. E2 Sirene is really good for him. But when we're not talking about E2 Sirene, and we're talking about Sirene's value overall, the future, even for what she's targeted for, being the Chrysos heirs, it's not great, right? She is probably the worst aging support I think I've ever seen in the history of HSR, because she hasn't even had her first rerun banner yet, and more than half of the teams from Amphorius don't give a shit about her anymore, when her entire existence is based around being a support for the Amphorius units, right? Love you all. Hope you have a great day. Hope you have a great night. Peace out.